The bottle didn't just hit the wall. It rang against the drywall with a sharp, metallic crack that made the whole room jump for a second. I was standing near the window with my son in my arms when it happened, still swaying a little from lifting him out of the swing, behind me. The swing kept moving on its own, the fabric seat rocking back and forth like nothing unusual had just happened. I remember staring at it longer than I should have, realizing something that made my chest tighten. 2 seconds earlier, that swing hadn't been empty, and if I had waited just a moment longer before picking him up, that bottle wouldn't have hit the wall. It would have hit my son. The apartment had its own quiet rules. Nobody ever wrote them down. Nobody even talked about them out loud. But after a while, you learn them the same way you learn where a loose stair creaks in the dark by living there long enough to know what not to do. Our place wasn't big, beige carpet that always looked slightly worn, a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom, and a living room where the baby swing sat near the window because that was the only corner that got sunlight in the afternoon. When the light came through the blinds just right, it landed across the blanket in the swing and made the room look softer than it really felt. The refrigerator hummed constantly in the kitchen, a low mechanical sound you stopped noticing after a while. Sometimes when the apartment was quiet, that hum was the loudest thing in the room. Quiet mattered. That was the first rule, if he was in a good mood. The apartment felt almost normal. He would sit on the couch with the TV remote balanced on his knee, scrolling through channels while the baby slept nearby. On nights like that, we could talk about small things, what groceries we needed, whether the baby had a doctor appointment coming up, stuff like that. But when his mood shifted, the whole place changed. You could hear it in the way he moved around the living room, a cabinet closing a little harder than usual, footsteps that carried more weight than they needed to, the TV volume jumping suddenly because he pressed the button too hard. Those were the moments when the other rules came into play. Don't slam doors. Don't ask too many questions. Don't contradict him when he's already irritated. I never announced to myself that I was following these rules. It just happened gradually. The way habits form when you're trying to keep the peace in a small space. By the time our son was born, I had already memorized most of them. The biggest shift came after he quit his job. At first it sounded temporary. He said the place was toxic, that he needed time to find something better. I didn't argue. I told myself it was reasonable to leave a job that made him miserable. But weeks passed, then months, and the paycheck that covered rent and groceries started coming entirely from my side. I worked long days and came home smelling faintly like disinfectant and baby powder from the daycare. Most evenings I stepped through the apartment door already trying to read the room before I even set my bag down. Sometimes he would barely look up. Sometimes he would start talking immediately about bills or money or how difficult things had been that day. Either way, I learned to move carefully through the apartment after work. I washed bottles quietly. I closed drawers slowly. Even the way I set plates in the sink changed so they wouldn't clink together too loudly. Because the truth was, the rules weren't really about keeping the apartment calm. They were about avoiding the moment when something in the room suddenly snapped. For a little while after the bottle hit the wall, things actually became quieter in the apartment. Not immediately. The first couple of days were tense in that strange way arguments leave behind, like the air still remembers what happened even after nobody is talking about it anymore. But after that, he started acting different. He apologized more than once. One night, while I was rinsing baby bottles in the sink, he leaned against the kitchen counter and told me he knew he had been out of line. His voice was calm, almost tired, the kind of tone people use when they want to sound sincere. "I've just been stressed," he said. "I'll get it together. You and the baby deserve better than this." I remember standing there with warm water running over my hands, watching soap bubbles slide down the side of the bottle. For a moment, I wanted to believe him so badly that my chest actually hurt. Because if that apology was real, it meant everything could still go back to normal, and for a short stretch of time, it almost looked like it was. He talked again about finding work, mentioned an interview a friend had told him about at a warehouse outside town. One evening, he even cooked dinner, nothing impressive. Just boxed pasta and jarred sauce, but the smell of tomato sauce filling the kitchen made the apartment feel strangely familiar again. Like the version of our life I had been hoping for was finally coming back. Those were the nights when he would sit on the couch holding our son while the television played quietly in the background. The baby would curl against his chest, half asleep, and for a few minutes it was easy to imagine we were just another tired couple figuring out parenthood together. But calm in our apartment never lasted long enough to feel stable. It was more like the quiet that settles in right before a storm moves through. The small signs kept showing up. A cupboard door slamming harder than necessary when he thought I had spent too much on groceries. A coffee mug dropped onto the counter with enough force that the sound made the baby startle in his swing. A muttered comment about how unfair it was that everything depended on my paycheck. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could easily explain to someone outside the apartment without sounding like you were exaggerating, but enough that my shoulders stayed tense even when the room was quiet. One afternoon, I stood in the kitchen warming a bottle while the baby slept in the swing near the window. The late sunlight made the fabric of the swing glow softly against the wall. From the living room, I could hear him moving around, opening drawers, pacing back and forth. Then his voice cut through the apartment. "Did you seriously spend this much on groceries?" The question wasn't loud yet, but something in the tone made my stomach tighten before I even answered. Because by then, I understood something about the way arguments started in that apartment. They almost never began with shouting. They began quietly. The argument that day started over something small enough that most people probably wouldn't even remember it a week later. Groceries. I had gone shopping that morning after work because the refrigerator was almost empty again. Milk, diapers, a couple frozen meals, baby wipes, formula backup even though I was nursing. The usual things that disappear faster than you expect when there's a newborn in the house. When he asked about the receipt, I was standing at the kitchen counter warming a bottle. The baby had fallen asleep in the swing by the window, the soft motor humming quietly as it rocked back and forth. I tried to answer calmly. "It's just the regular stuff," I said. "Diapers and groceries." He walked into the kitchen holding the receipt between two fingers like it had personally offended him. "This is over $200. His voice wasn't loud yet. That was the part I always noticed, first the calm tone that sat right on the edge of something worse. I explained the prices had gone up, that diapers alone were almost $50 now, that the formula was backup in case something happened with nursing. The conversation might have ended there if he had wanted it to, but he didn't. He started pacing between the kitchen and the living room, the receipt still in his hand, muttering about how everything depended on my paycheck now, about how unfair it was that he had to rely on someone else while he figured things out. I kept my voice low because the baby was asleep. "You said you were looking for work," I reminded him quietly. That was the moment something shifted. It wasn't instant yelling. It was slower than that. He grabbed the insulated water bottle sitting on the coffee table, the kind people carry everywhere now, heavy metal with a thick lid. I had filled it earlier that morning before leaving for work. For a second, he just held it. Then he threw it. Not at me exactly, but not away from me either. The bottle slammed into the drywall beside the kitchen doorway with a sharp metallic crack that echoed through the apartment. The sound was so sudden it felt like the entire room jumped. I froze, behind me. The baby swing was still moving gently, the fabric seat rocking in the sunlight that spilled through the blinds. Empty. My arms tightened around my son without me even thinking about it. I had picked him up maybe 2 seconds earlier because he had started fussing in his sleep. 2 seconds. The bottle hit the wall hard enough that it bounced once before landing on the carpet. Neither of us spoke for a moment. He looked at the wall like he had surprised himself. I stared at the swing, because in that moment something rearranged itself inside my head in a way I hadn't allowed before. Up until then, I had spent 2 years explaining things away. He was stressed, he was frustrated, he didn't mean it. But standing there with my son in my arms, watching that empty swing move slowly back and forth, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The problem wasn't just that he had thrown something. The problem was that he hadn't even looked where it might land. And for the first time since we had started this life together, the thought crossed my mind with a clarity that felt almost physical. This wasn't just a bad relationship. This was a dangerous house to raise a baby in. After that day, nothing dramatic happened, and in a strange way, that made things harder. Because once you realize something is dangerous, but you still have to live inside it, your whole brain shifts into a different mode. Every ordinary moment starts feeling like something you have to measure carefully. The apartment looked exactly the same beige carpet, same narrow hallway, same baby swing near the window catching the afternoon light. If someone had walked in off the street, they probably would have thought we were just a tired young couple adjusting to life with a newborn. But for me, the apartment had turned into something else. It was a place I needed to escape from, quietly. The biggest problem was simple: he was always there. When someone doesn't have a job and rarely leaves the apartment, you don't get normal windows of time. There was no predictable schedule where I could pack things or make calls without him noticing. If I stepped outside, he usually asked where I was going. Even going to the grocery store sometimes turned into a joint trip, so I started moving through my days more carefully than ever. On the surface, nothing changed. I still worked. I still came home, cooked simple meals, washed bottles, folded tiny baby clothes that smelled faintly like laundry detergent. If he was watching television, I sat on the other end of the couch with the baby and tried to act like my mind wasn't constantly calculating possibilities. But behind that routine, I was quietly preparing. The first thing I did was start documenting everything. At night, after the baby fell asleep, I would sit at the small kitchen table with my phone and write down things I remembered from the day: who fed the baby, who changed him, doctor appointments, purchases, small details that probably looked boring to anyone else but might matter later. My dad had told me that if things ever ended up in family court, records like that could help show who was actually taking care of the child day to day. So I wrote everything down. Sometimes I also recorded short voice memos after arguments, nothing dramatic, just descriptions while the memory was still fresh. The strange part was that while I was quietly preparing to leave, he seemed to believe things were improving. For about 4 days, he tried harder. He played with the baby more in the evenings, asked if I needed help warming bottles, even talked again about getting serious about job interviews. If someone had seen us during that stretch, they might have thought our relationship was stabilizing. But once you've had a realization like the one I had in that kitchen, it doesn't disappear just because someone behaves well for a few days. If anything, the calm made me more alert, because it reminded me how quickly things could flip. The hardest part was pretending that I wasn't mentally packing our lives into invisible boxes, pretending that I wasn't quietly texting my family during work breaks, telling them pieces of what had been happening: my dad, my mom, a couple people I trusted enough to keep it quiet. Within a few days, they all knew. They didn't panic. They didn't pressure me. They just told me the same thing in different ways. Whenever you're ready, we'll help you. So the plan slowly started forming. Find work back in my hometown. Figure out housing. Talk to the leasing office about breaking the lease safely. Move small things out little by little so it wouldn't look suspicious. My stepsister lived in the same town as us. So sometimes when we met for coffee, I would hand her a small bag of baby clothes or paperwork. She would take it back to my dad's place to store. None of it looked dramatic from the outside, just small movements, small preparations. But the entire time, there was one problem hanging over everything. I still needed a moment when he wasn't there. And days kept passing where that moment never came, because every morning when I woke up, he was still in the apartment. And every night when I put the baby to sleep, he was still there too. Living like that felt like sitting in a room where you knew a storm would come back eventually. You just didn't know exactly when. The moment finally came in a way I hadn't expected. He got sick. It wasn't dramatic, just one of those miserable colds that keep someone up all night coughing and pacing around the apartment. I barely slept because the baby was restless too, and the two sounds kept blending together: the soft whir of the swing motor and him moving back and forth down the hallway. By morning, he looked exhausted. For once, he didn't follow me when I said I needed to step out for a bit. "I'm just going to run to the store," I told him, keeping my voice casual while I zipped up my jacket. He barely looked up from the couch. "Fine, just don't be long." I remember stepping outside and realizing my hands were shaking, not because anything dramatic had happened, nothing had. The parking lot looked the same as it did every other morning. A couple of neighbors loading groceries into their cars, someone walking a dog across the cracked asphalt. But it was the first time in months I had left that apartment alone without him watching me go. I drove straight to my dad's house. The whole time I kept expecting my phone to ring with him asking where I was. It never did. The drive felt longer than it actually was, probably because my mind was racing through every possibility of what could happen next. When I walked into my dad's kitchen, the smell of coffee filled the room. He looked up from the table and immediately knew something was wrong before I even said anything. We talked for almost 2 hours, not loudly, not dramatically, just laying everything out piece by piece what had been happening in the apartment, the bottle hitting the wall, the constant tension, the way I had been documenting everything. He listened the entire time without interrupting. Then he gave me advice that changed how I approached the next few days. "Don't rush it," he said, "but be ready the moment you get a safe window." After that conversation, the plan became clearer. I started coordinating things more carefully. My mom began helping me look into custody attorneys back home. My leasing office quietly explained how breaking a lease due to domestic safety concerns could work. My stepsister kept storing the small bags I passed to her whenever we met. All of us were basically waiting for the same thing, an opening. It finally happened a few days later. That morning felt strangely ordinary. The baby had just been to the doctor the day before because he was sick, and the apartment smelled faintly like the minty ointment I had rubbed on his chest the night before. We were sitting in the living room when he suddenly grabbed his keys. "I need to run out for a bit," he said. It took everything in me not to react. I nodded like it was nothing. "Okay." When the front door closed, I stood there for a second listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway outside our apartment. Then I moved. I didn't pack suitcases. That would have taken too long. Instead, I grabbed the laundry basket I had already been using as a cover for weeks. Most of the baby's worn clothes were already in there. My documents were folded at the bottom under a towel. I picked up my son, grabbed the basket, and walked out the door. The hallway smelled faintly like someone cooking onions in another unit. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears while I locked the door behind me. I left a note on the kitchen counter explaining why I had gone and how we would handle the rest through legal channels. Then I carried my son down the stairs, out to my car, and drove away from that apartment for the last time. He called me again and again during that drive. I watched the phone light up on the passenger seat, but I didn't answer. For the first time in a long time, I didn't have to. By the time I pulled into my dad's driveway, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. The baby had fallen asleep in the car seat halfway through the drive. His small hand curled against the strap across his chest. The car engine ticked quietly as it cooled, and for a moment I just sat there in the driver's seat, staring at the front porch. It was strange how normal everything looked. My dad opened the front door before I even knocked. He had probably been watching for the car when he stepped outside and helped carry the laundry basket inside. Neither of us said much at first. There wasn't really anything to say. I was safe. My son was safe. And for the first time in a long time, the air around me didn't feel tense. The next few weeks were messy in practical ways. I spoke with a custody attorney about what the process might look like. I worked with the leasing office to finalize leaving the apartment. Paperwork, phone calls, figuring out what life was going to look like from here. Nothing happened overnight. Real life rarely works like that, but the quiet in my dad's house felt different from the quiet in that apartment. Here, the baby swing in the corner of the living room moved gently when my son kicked his feet, and no one was throwing anything across the room anymore. If you've ever had to leave a place that felt unsafe just to protect your child, you probably understand how heavy that decision can feel. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't to fight. It's to walk away and build something safer somewhere else. What would you have done in that moment?